Carmel by the Sea, California. June 1988. 2 in the morning. The Pacific fog has rolled in off the water, thick and cold, the kind that swallows street lamps whole and turns the pine trees along Ocean Avenue into dark, faceless shapes. The kind of fog that makes a small town feel like the edge of the world. You can smell it before you understand what it means. Salt and pine and something else underneath. Something chemical. Something wrong. A man stands alone in a room that smells of smoke. Not the romantic smoke of a fireplace. Not the warm, amber smoke of a good cigar. This is the smell of something irreplaceable burning. Chemical. Ancient. The specific, nauseating odor of nitrate film stock. A smell that every archivist in America had learned to dread because it meant history was dying, and there was nothing you could do to bring it back. He is 58 years old, 6'4". He has spent the last 30 years playing men who stare down impossible odds without blinking. Men who walk into burning buildings because someone has to. Men who do the right thing, not because it is easy, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Here, in the dark, with no camera rolling and no audience watching, Clint Eastwood looks down at what is left of a life's work, and he makes a decision. Not a loud decision, not a press conference, not a lawsuit, not a speech. The kind of decision that never gets written into a contract, never gets announced at a ceremony, never gets a standing ovation at the Academy Awards. The kind of decision that happens in silence and stays there. This is not a story about a movie. This is not a story about a mayor. This is not a story about a legend protecting his own legacy. This is a story about what a man does when no one is watching, and no one will ever know. In his left hand, a single reel of nitrate film, thin as paper, as dangerous as a loaded gun. The images on it are fading. The man who made them is dying. And Clint Eastwood, the most famous face in American cinema, is the only person on earth who seems to care enough to do something about it. We will come back to this room. We will come back to this reel of film, and the man whose name is on it, and what Clint Eastwood did next. But not yet. To understand what Clint Eastwood saw that night, you have to understand what nitrate film actually is. You have to go back to the very beginning, before digital, before color, before sound, before any of it. The movies that built Hollywood, the westerns, the noir thrillers, the silent comedies, the war pictures, all of them were shot on nitrate film stock, a material so chemically unstable, so deep in its capacity for destruction, that the industry spent decades pretending the problem didn't exist. Here is what nitrate film does when it goes wrong. You don't need a match. You don't need an open flame. At 40 degrees Celsius, a temperature you can reach on a warm California afternoon inside an unventilated storage room, nitrate film begins to decompose on its own. It releases nitrogen dioxide gas. It builds internal pressure. And then, without warning, without mercy, it ignites. And here is the part that should stop you cold. It burns underwater. You cannot drown a nitrate fire. You cannot smother it. Once it starts, it feeds itself, because nitrate film carries its own oxygen inside its chemical structure. Fire crews in the 1930s learned this the hard way, watching storage vaults burn for hours, while they stood helpless outside, with hoses pointed at flames that simply would not die. This is what Hollywood built its golden age on. This is the material on which every frame of Gone with the Wind, every frame of Casablanca, every frame of Clint Eastwood's earliest screen appearances was recorded. And by the time 1988 arrived, by the time that fog rolled into Carmel and Clint stood alone in that room, the industry had already lost more than half of everything ever made before 1951. Gone. Permanently. Forever. Not stolen, not sold, simply neglected into ash. If you were standing in one of those storage rooms in 1987, you would not have known you were watching history end. You would have seen metal canisters stacked on shelves. You would have smelled something faintly chemical, something faintly sweet, the early stage of nitrate decomposition before it turns dangerous. You would have assumed someone was handling it, someone responsible, someone who knew what was in those cans and understood what losing it would mean. You would have been wrong. Here's what most people miss about that loss. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single catastrophic explosion, no villain who ordered the destruction, no villain who could be put on trial and convicted. The death of early cinema happened slowly, quietly, in storage facilities across the country, in basement vaults where temperature controls were never installed, in studio warehouses where cans of film sat stacked floor to ceiling, slowly turning to powder, slowly releasing their toxic gas into the dark, with nobody watching and nobody caring enough to check. MGM lost thousands of reels this way. Fox lost more. Universal, the studio that would one day suffer a catastrophic fire of its own, had been allowing irreplaceable masters to degrade for decades, quietly reclassifying old film prints as expired assets on balance sheets, writing them off as liabilities instead of treating them as what they actually were: history, culture. Pardon, things that once gone cannot be replaced at any price. Now watch what happens when a human being who actually understands this, who has spent his entire adult life making films, breathing films, living films, walks into a room and confronts what that negligence looks like up close. Clint Eastwood had been watching this happen for years, quietly. The way he watched most things, with those pale, unreadable eyes that directors from Sergio Leone to Don Siegel all described the same way. Not cold, not angry, calculating. The eyes of a man who is already 3 moves ahead, already deciding what he is going to do, already committing to it before he says a single word. Don Siegel saw it too. Don Siegel, 77 years old in 1988, the man who directed Clint in 5 films including Dirty Harry, the man who more than anyone else taught Clint Eastwood how to build a scene, how to hold a camera, how to let silence do the work that lesser directors filled with noise. Don Siegel was watching his life's work disappear. Not metaphorically, literally. The prints of his films, Riot in Cell Block 11, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Beguiled, were degrading in storage facilities he had no control over, in vaults owned by studios that had long since moved on to the next deal, the next franchise, the next quarter's earnings report. Siegel had made 35 films across 4 decades. He had no guarantee that future generations would ever be able to see most of them. He said something to Clint that year. The exact words were never recorded, never transcribed into any official biography. But Richard Schickel, Clint's official biographer, the man who spent more time inside Eastwood's world than perhaps any journalist alive, wrote that in the late 1980s, Siegel had confronted his former student with a question that had no comfortable answer. He asked, "Who will remember what we made, if what we made no longer exists?" Clint did not answer immediately. He never did. He let the question sit in the room the way he let silences sit on screen, heavy, deliberate, doing its work on everyone present. And then he said something that Fritz Maines, his producer and oldest friend, would recall years later in an interview with American cinematographer. He said, "Then we fix it." 3 words. No elaboration, no timeline, no budget, no plan laid out for a committee to approve. Just 3 words delivered with the same quiet, immovable certainty that had made him the most bankable star in the world. Then we fix it. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Think about the person who taught you the most important thing you know, Not a book, not a school. A person. Someone who gave you a framework for how to move through the world, how to work, how to hold yourself, how to face the moments when everything goes wrong and the easy path is right there in front of you, and you choose the hard one anyway. Now, imagine watching everything that person built, every proof that their life meant something, every artifact of their best work, slowly disappearing, and imagine that you have the power to stop it. But stopping it means going up against institutions so large, so indifferent, so locked into their own financial logic that the mere act of confronting them will cost you relationships, money, and political capital you have spent decades building. What do? If you are still here, if this story is landing the way I think it is, hit that subscribe button. Because what Clint Eastwood did next is the part nobody ever tells you. And I'm not going to rush it. Lew Wasserman ran Hollywood. That is not hyperbole. That is not the kind of thing people say loosely about powerful men to make them sound more impressive than they are. In 1988, Lew Wasserman, chairman of MCA, parent company of Universal Studios, was, by any measurable standard, the single most powerful individual in the American entertainment industry. He had been an agent, a deal maker, a studio executive, a political kingmaker. He had personally shaped the careers of Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Stewart, and Marlon Brando. He had been doing business in Hollywood since before Clint Eastwood was born. He was also, in the precise and unsentimental language of the boardroom, completely correct about the economics of film preservation. Old films did not make money. Restoring old films cost enormous amounts of money. The math was brutally simple, and no amount of cultural argument could change it. Studios were not charities. Archives were not profit centers. And any executive who proposed spending millions of dollars to restore films that generated zero box office revenue would be asked, very politely, to explain that decision to shareholders. This is the world Clint Eastwood walked into. Not with lawyers. Not with a press release designed to shame Universal into action. Not with a phone call from his publicist requesting a meeting. Clint Eastwood walked into Lew Wasserman's office the way his characters always entered a room. Quietly, directly, without announcing himself as a threat until it was too late to prepare for one. The meeting was private. No assistants present. No minutes taken. What passed between them in that office exists only in the accounts of people who heard it secondhand, but the shape of it is clear enough from what happened afterward. Clint laid out the problem: specific films, specific storage facilities, specific rates of degradation. He had done his homework the way he always did, thoroughly, methodically, without waste. He was not emotional. He was not sentimental. He presented the destruction of cinematic history the way a contractor presents a structural assessment. Here is what is failing. Here is the rate at which it is failing. And here is what happens if nothing is done. Wasserman listened. Wasserman was always gracious. Wasserman thanked him for coming. And Wasserman explained, with the smooth, unassailable calm of a man who had been saying no to powerful people for 50 years, that this was not Universal's problem to solve alone. But it gets stranger. Clint did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Not in boardrooms, not on film sets, not in the mayor's office in Carmel, where he had spent 2 years learning that the most effective kind of power is the kind that never needs to announce itself. He shook Lew Wasserman's hand. He thanked him for his time. He walked out of the building, got into his car, and drove back up the coast toward Carmel. And 3 weeks later, without telling anyone in the industry, without issuing a single public statement, without positioning himself for a single favorable profile in Variety or The Hollywood Reporter, he picked up the phone and called Robert A. Harris. Robert A. Harris was, in 1988, the most respected film restoration specialist in the United States. He had brought Lawrence of Arabia back from the dead. He would later do the same for Vertigo, for My Fair Lady, for Spartacus. He understood nitrate film the way a surgeon understands the body, not as an abstraction, but as a living, breathing, catastrophically fragile system that required constant, expert attention to survive. Harris would later say, in a rare 1997 interview, that he had received calls from studios, from foundations, from government cultural agencies. He had worked with them all. He had never received a call quite like this one. The man on the other end of the line did not introduce himself with his credits, did not mention Dirty Harry, or the good, the bad, and the ugly, or the $50 million his last film had made at the domestic box office. He introduced himself with a list, a specific, handwritten list of films that were currently degrading in storage facilities across Southern California. And then he said 4 words that Harris would remember for the rest of his career. What can still be saved? Robert A. Harris called back within 48 hours. The list was worse than expected, far worse. Harris had cross-referenced Clint's handwritten inventory against his own records, against the Library of Congress Film Preservation Database, against the catalog maintained by the American Film Institute, an organization that had been sounding the alarm about nitrate degradation for years, to an industry that responded with polite indifference and returned to its quarterly projections. What Harris found was not a crisis approaching. It was a crisis already in progress. Dozens of films, not obscure films, not forgotten pictures that nobody had ever cared about, but significant works of American cinema, were at what archivists call the point of no return, the stage beyond which restoration becomes impossible, the stage where the chemical damage has eaten so deep into the film stock that the images themselves begin to disappear, frame by frame, like a photograph left too long in direct sunlight, fading, distorting, gone. Pay attention to this. Among them, buried in a universal storage facility in the San Fernando Valley, in a climate-uncontrolled room that a facilities manager had apparently not entered in 3 years, were multiple prints of The Beguiled, 1971, directed by Don Siegel, starring Clint Eastwood, Geraldine Page, and Elizabeth Hartman. A Civil War Gothic, strange, dark, psychologically dense, in a way that made studio executives deeply uncomfortable and critics deeply divided. It had been a commercial failure on its original release. Universal had quietly buried it, pulled it from circulation, allowed it to drift into the margins of both men's filmographies. Don Siegel considered it his finest work. He had said so publicly more than once, in interviews that the entertainment press largely ignored, because nobody wanted to read about a box office disappointment when they could read about Dirty Harry instead. He had said so privately to Clint, in conversations that Fritz Mainz later described as some of the most candid exchanges he had ever witnessed between a director and his former star. Siegel believed that The Beguiled was the film that showed what both of them were truly capable of, freed from genre expectation, freed from the commercial machinery of the action film, doing something genuinely dangerous and alive. And it was rotting in a box in the San Fernando Valley. Here is the part nobody tells you. Clint Eastwood had been preparing for this moment for years, not consciously perhaps, not with a plan written out on paper and filed in a drawer, but the infrastructure was already there, built quietly, methodically, the way he built everything. If you knew what Malpaso's internal archive looked like compared to anything else in Hollywood at the time, you would understand why Harris said yes immediately. Malpaso Productions, Clint's personal production company, had maintained an internal film preservation policy since the mid-1980s that was unlike anything else in the industry. Every film Malpaso produced, every single one, was archived in temperature-controlled storage at multiple locations, original camera negatives, sound stems, behind-the-scenes footage. Dailies that most productions simply threw away. All of it cataloged, protected, maintained at Clint's personal expense. Fritz Mounce had revealed the outlines of this policy in his 1985 interview with American cinematographer, though even Mounce, who had known Clint since they were young men together in the California National Guard, admitted that he did not fully understand the scope of what Clint was doing until years later. What Clint was doing was building a model, not for Malpaso alone, for what he believed the entire industry should be doing, and wasn't. You have to understand what that condition meant to a conservator. Clint had watched Hollywood treat its own history as a renewable resource, as though great films could simply be remade if the originals were lost, as though the specific texture of a 1953 noir or a 1964 Italian Western, the grain of the image, the particular quality of light that a technoscope lens produced, the performances that existed in those frames and nowhere else, could somehow be reconstructed from memory and good intentions. It could not. Clint understood this the way he understood everything about filmmaking, not theoretically, but physically, in his hands and his eyes, after decades of standing behind cameras and in front of them. He understood that a film is not a story that can be retold. It is a moment that was captured, and moments, once lost, are lost absolutely. So when Robert A. Harris came back to him with the full assessment, with the list of what was dying and what was already dead, and what could still, with immediate intervention and significant resources, be pulled back from the edge, Clint did not hesitate. He gave Harris a budget, a number that Harris, to his credit and to his discretion, has never publicly disclosed, a number that those who know describe only in the vaguest terms. Significant, substantial, enough to change the trajectory of what was possible. And then Clint attached one condition, a single, non-negotiable condition that Harris accepted without argument, because he understood immediately, the moment Clint stated it, that it was the only condition that made the whole thing make sense. No credit, no acknowledgement, no press release, no foundation named after him, no plaque on the wall of a restored archive, no acceptance speech at a preservation gala. His name was not to appear in any documentation connected to the project. Nothing. He was not doing this to be seen doing it. He was not doing this to add a philanthropic chapter to an already extraordinary biography. He was doing this because Don Siegel had asked him a question: who will remember what we made if what we made no longer exists? And Clint Eastwood had decided, in the privacy of his own conscience, that the answer was going to be, I will. Me. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without anyone knowing. The way the best things always get done. Robert A. Harris went to work in the autumn of 1988. He assembled a small team, 3 conservators, 2 laboratory technicians, 1 specialist in nitrate chemical stabilization, whose name appears in no Hollywood trade publication from that era because there was no Hollywood trade publication covering this kind of work. Nobody wrote about film preservation in 1988. Nobody ran features on the men and women who spent their days in climate-controlled rooms, wearing cotton gloves, holding deteriorating film reels up to light tables, and deciding, frame by frame, what could be salvaged and what was already beyond saving. It was invisible work, unglamorous, painstaking in a way that the word painstaking was invented to describe. Each frame of a damaged nitrate print requiring individual examination, individual treatment, individual decisions about chemical intervention versus simple, heartbreaking acceptance that this particular image was gone and would not be coming back. Harris would later describe the condition of the beguiled print when his team first opened the storage canister. The outer reels had fused partially to their metal cores. The film base had turned brittle, shrinking inward the way old skin shrinks, contracting, pulling, threatening to crack along the sprocket holes with every attempted movement. The image itself, in the most damaged sections, had gone to a deep amber brown, the crystals that carried Siegel's compositions dissolving back into chemical chaos. It took 4 months. 4 months of work that nobody outside that laboratory knew was happening. 4 months, funded by a man whose name appeared nowhere in the project documentation, listed in the dry language of archive paperwork only as a private donor whose identity was to remain confidential at the donor's express request. Stay with me, because this is the part where the story stops being about film preservation and starts being about something much larger. Something that has nothing to do with Hollywood, and everything to do with the kind of man you decide to be when the scaffolding of public expectation is removed and you are left alone with your own choices. Don Siegel never knew. Let that land for a moment. The man whose life's work was quietly, methodically being pulled back from oblivion. The man who had stood in front of a camera with Clint Eastwood on 5 different films, who had taught him how to build tension with negative space, how to let an actor's stillness carry more dramatic weight than any amount of movement or noise, who had sat across from his former student and asked the question that set all of this in motion. Don Siegel spent the final years of his life believing that his films were lost. Not all of them, but enough of them. Enough to carry the particular grief that aging artists carry when they begin to suspect that the world has moved on from their work while they are still alive to watch it happen. He died in April 1991. He was 80 years old. He had been ill for some time, a series of strokes that took his speech first, and then, gradually, the rest. In his final months, he was largely beyond reach, present but unreachable. Somewhere behind his eyes, behind the stillness that illness imposes on a man who spent his entire life in motion, Clint visited him. More than once, in those final months, Clint made the drive to see Don Siegel. He did not talk about the restoration project. He did not tell Siegel what Harris and his team had accomplished, did not describe the condition of the beguiled print when they first opened it, or the condition it was in when they finished. He sat with his friend and his teacher in the specific, irreplaceable way that presence is its own language. The way you sit with someone when words have run out, and what remains is simply the fact of being there. This is not a story about film preservation. This is not a story about a mayor doing his civic duty. This is not even a story about Clint Eastwood, the director. This is a story about a man who understood that the greatest things you do in life are the ones nobody ever sees. Siegel's last recorded words about his former student, spoken to a visiting journalist sometime in 1990, transcribed in a profile that ran in a film quarterly that no longer exists, were 7 words. 7 words. Clint didn't need me to teach him. He meant it as a compliment, a final, clean acknowledgement from a master to the student who had surpassed him. But sitting with it now, knowing what we know, knowing what Clint was doing in that laboratory in those months, knowing the condition of those film reels when Harris first opened them, knowing the single condition Clint had attached to every dollar of that funding, those 7 words carry a weight that Siegel himself may not have fully understood he was placing in them. Clint didn't need him to teach him. He had already learned the most important lesson, not from a film set, not from a director's chair. From watching a man he loved ask a question that deserved an answer, and deciding, in the quiet of his own conscience, to be the answer. There is a version of this story that never gets told. Not because it is secret, though parts of it are. Not because the people involved tried to hide it, though one of them explicitly did. But because the version of this story that gets told, the version that fills the magazine profiles and the documentary segments and the career retrospectives, is the version with the box office numbers and the Oscar speeches, and the iconic film stills. That version is true, and it is incomplete. Here is what is also true. First, Clint Eastwood built his entire public identity on the image of a man who acts without explanation, who does the right thing without needing anyone to witness it. Most people assume that was a character. A carefully constructed persona that served him well across 6 decades of stardom. What the story of Don Siegel and Robert A. Harris and those 4 months in an unmarked laboratory tells you is that it was never a character at all. It was just who he was. Second, we live in a moment that has made performance of virtue into a competitive sport. Every act of generosity documented. Every donation announced. Every good deed offered up to the scrolling, judging, perpetually distracted attention of the crowd. Clint Eastwood, a man who had more access to that crowd than almost anyone alive, looked at all of it and chose silence. Chose darkness. Chose to let the work speak without his name attached to it. That is not humility as a strategy. That is humility as a way of being. Third, somewhere tonight in a cinema or on a screen in a living room or on a laptop balanced on a stranger's knees on a long flight somewhere over the Pacific, someone is watching The Beguiled for the first time. They do not know what condition that film was in 36 years ago. They do not know the name of the man who funded its restoration, or the condition of the reels when Harris first opened them, or the single condition Clint had attached to every dollar of that funding. They just know that the film is beautiful, that it does something to them that they will carry out of the room when it is over, that Don Siegel made something that deserved to survive. And it did. Because one man, in the dark, in the fog, in the specific and unglamorous silence of a decision that no one would ever applaud, decided that it should. Now I want to hear from you. What is the one Clint Eastwood moment, on screen or off, that showed you the real man behind the icon? Tell me in the comments below, because I have a feeling this audience knows things about Clint Eastwood that would fill another 10 videos. And if this story moved you, if it gave you something to carry, share it with someone who needs it today. Clint Eastwood once said that he does not spend much time looking back. He never had to. The work was already there, waiting, lasting. That is enough.